Okay, now this next chapter is called A Wasp School, and you guys, hold on to your hair, because I have to say, there's a section in here that I was absolutely slammed to the floor by. I could not even believe what I was reading. Hello, how are you? My name is Tia Denise, and today we're going to keep going in The Other Mrs. Kennedy. And Ethel Kennedy is all over this episode today and for the remainder of the book. So, you know, we've been talking about her family, some of her early family, and it's taken us a minute to get up to Ethel. But now we're going to talk about a section in the book called The Greenwich Years, and they've moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, supposedly because the taxes were better, but also it was an enclave of the elite. They are not welcome. They are the nouveau riche, and it is very evident that they don't fit in, and it is not what it was when they were in New York. So when they were in New York, they had this sprawling property, but they also were in an environment with more Catholic families and people who kind of understood their way of life a little bit better. And now they are over here in an enclave known as the WASP community. And of course, you know that means White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which is a term that I greatly despise. I think it's a complete pejorative. I remember sitting in a history class when I was in college and my professor using that term, and I raised my hand and I said, I think that that's actually exceedingly inappropriate to categorize a whole group of people by their race and religion, and to heap upon it all of these stereotypes. I said, would we ever do that with any other race? And I got raked over the coals for asking. But I still think that it is deeply, deeply inappropriate. But it's used in this book consistently, and people know what that means. So anyway, they had moved into this WASP community, and they were very, and they were shunned. So the Greenwich Years is going to talk all about that. They're going to talk about the way the family tried to assimilate with this Protestant group of people. They desperately wanted to be accepted by the richest people in American society, by some of the oldest money in American society. And it was a slog. Big Anne's having problems with it. Now, Ethel is going to have less problems with it because she was young when she got there. We're going to see her father insist to Big Anne for the first time that they don't put the younger girls in a Catholic school, that they can go to Catholic college and Catholic boarding schools. But for their grammar school, he'd love for them to go to a non-denominational school, because then maybe they can get the younger kids assimilated. And if they can get the younger kids assimilated, then maybe on the backs of that, they can sort of, ride into society. But the thing is that the Skakels were not just not Protestant. They were also a family that was just big and flashy and just different than a lot of their sort of buttoned up neighbors. So this chapter, and this whole section, which is going to take several episodes to cover the Greenwich Years, is exceedingly interesting to me, because it's so interesting to see that dynamic between the nouveau riche and old money, and just the slog and the continual effort that they made to find their niche in this society that very certainly did not want them. Okay, so the first chapter is called Lake Avenue. I was wondering, Anne, why in the world would you have moved to Greenwich of all places? Dodo Jacob asked, standing in the driveway of Rambleside, the Skakel's enormous estate. Taxes, my dear, Big Anne responded. That's the only reason. Taxes. An old line, genteel Beacon Hill Episcopalian who had attended Miss Porter's with George Bush's mother, and upcoming far removed from Big Anne's South Side Chicago roots, Mrs. Jacob was the mother of Anita Pan Jacob, one of Ethel's closest friends at her new school, Greenwich Academy. The Skakels' recent move into the mansion of Lake Avenue in Greenwich, Connecticut, a white Anglo-Saxon bastion of privilege and wealth, had set the tongues of the blue bloods wagging. Who, they wondered, was this new family that seemed so out of place? Mrs. Jacob, wife of a globe-trotting international telephone and telegraph executive, was one of the few women in town whom even acknowledged Big Anne's presence, and that only because their daughters were school chums. She seized the moment to get some answers. Big Anne explained that George was taking home an enormous salary from his company. Mr. Skakel just can't help making money, she said almost apologetically, and had been paying a healthy chunk of it to the state of New York. Since there was no income tax in Connecticut and real estate taxes were lower, their decision to move across the state line and settle in Greenwich had been based strictly on economics. The Great Depression was still racking the land when the Skakels moved in. but its impact was barely visible in Greenwich, though the crash had wrought some changes. Membership in the fashionable Indian Harbor Yacht Club had dropped from 345 to 167. A few chauffeurs had been laid off, and some of the wealthy families had reduced their full-time staffs. But less than 1,000 of Greenwich's small working-class populations were unemployed, and they were quickly put to work grading streets and landscaping school and park grounds, their salaries coming out of a $41,000 fund established by the town. A lot of people in Greenwich, such as our family, didn't even know there was a depression, observed Peggy Clipstein Larned, a daughter of old money, who'd become a friend of Ethel's. Life seemed the same. When Zalman Gilbert Simmons, heir to the Simmons mattress fortune, died in 1934, his widow, Frances, couldn't bear to live alone in the 30-room English country manor house they'd shared since the place was built in the 1920s. Even though her sons, Zalman Jr. and Grant, occupied two immense homes on either side. Once again, George Skakel was the right place at the right time with cash in his pocket. Because the Depression was at its peak, there was no interest in buyers, and an extremely wealthy widow anxious to sell at any price. Dad paid $100,000 for the house, recalled Rushton Skakel. In those days, that was a fortune to most people, but the price was a bargain. Yay. $100,000 is crazy cheap for what they end up getting. As we go on, they're going to describe the palatial spread of this home, and I can't even believe that there was any time at any place in history that this place would have gone for $100,000. I mean, it really just makes you realize how desperate people were during the Depression. The Skakels, who'd moved east with only their clothing, bought the Simmons place fully furnished. The furniture was big and heavy and dark, great big tables and sideboards and ornate things, almost like church pieces, recalled Pat Grant Mudge, who became a friend of Ethel's. You couldn't use those pieces in any other house because they were so monstrously large. Rarely did anyone set foot in the formal living room on the first floor, which was filled with furniture covered in old plush velvet and had a large organ that looked like it came from the set of the Phantom of the Opera. Most of the family used the more comfortable and warm second-floor living room, which was connected to a sun porch, where George and Big Ann often slept. The house in Greenwich, where Ethel grew up, was magnificent. The 3-story stone and brick mansion with its vari-colored slate roof and seamed granite trim consisted of a 25-foot entrance hall with an inlaid copper and black marble floor that was part of the design of Elsie de Wolfe, the famed interior decorator who'd been a personal friend of Frances Simmons. By the way, remember, she was the interior decorator for Wallace and Edward VIII. Do we recall? Anyway, the handsome library, which was almost 60 feet in length, had a black marble fireplace, teak floors, recessed bookcases, Corinthian columns, and immense bay windows that looked out to the spectacular grounds. Outside, there were 60,000 irises, an 8-acre spring-fed lake. 8-acre! Stately elm trees, which cost Zalman Simmons thousands of dollars to truck in and replant, boxwood borders formal gardens, a wisteria-covered pergola that led to the Adam and Eve garden, a 150-foot reflecting pool with a fountain in its center, greenhouses, vegetable gardens, grape arbors, an apple and pear orchard, and majestic sweeping lawns. Before the Depression, the Simmonses had 83 gardeners working on the property every day. When George bought the place, he added an elevator near the kitchen for the use of his aging mother-in-law and Big Ann, and a 75-foot swimming pool. Besides the main house, which also consisted of 6 double bedrooms, 2 single bedrooms, 3 staff bedrooms, 6 baths, a master suite with sitting room, fireplace, 2 dressing rooms with baths, a heated glass-enclosed sleeping porch, billiard room, children's playroom, there was also a guest house, tea house, 2 servants' houses, a 6-car garage, and a small stable. For $100,000. Chump change, my friends. That old lady basically gave that house to the Skakels. Rambleside was one of the most spectacular estates and one of the most desirable areas of Greenwich, and with the colorful Skakels in residence, it would become one of the most notorious homes in town. They were a speck wilder than the staid group in Greenwich, observed Bobby Banks Kaufman, who would go to school in Greenwich with Ethel, and whose father was the realtor who sold the Simmons house to the Skakels. They had fancy cars, and they were full of pizzazz. Peggy Clipstein Larned noted that the Skakels were a harum-scarum family, high-spirited bunch. My parents were established, and the Skakels were not, so they just never crossed paths. My parents were established, so they just never crossed paths. I have to say that, in the previous chapter, I did sort of act shocked at the way the Skakels ran their home, and I still think that there needed to be some parental overview of what was happening, you have a big family with a lot of kids. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that the parents couldn't possibly know about because there's just so many kids. I come from a family of 5. I had cousins with big families, and when we'd get together, the grown-ups would be talking and we'd be doing our thing, right? So there's no possible way the grown-ups could have known what we were doing every second, and I get that. But also, none of us grew up as alcoholics at age 16. You know what I'm saying? So it's like there's a fine line between letting the kids play and then like letting the kids run wild. But with that being said, it did say in the last chapter, wow, it's pretty wild. But I found myself really indignant on the side of the Skakels when I was reading this because I'm so annoyed by how they are pushed away from society. And people didn't even bother to get to know them. They're just like, oh, well, we're established. And we don't cross paths with the unestablished. Nouveau riche, I believe, is the term. Really gross. Just pathetic behavior. Anyway, Priscilla Pixie Meek, one of Ethel's closest childhood friends, summed up the general view. Ethel's family was a bit bizarre. When George moved to Lake Avenue, he was under the misguided, naive impression that Greenwich would welcome him with open arms and respect, as a self-made millionaire amassing a fortune at the height of the Depression. But the Skakels' arrival was met with silence and upturned noses. Some longtime Greenwich residents viewed them harshly. One old family, who eventually befriended the Skakel boys, said that his parents thought of the newcomers as rowdy Irish. A lot of it had to do with whether you'd gone to Yale, Harvard, or Princeton. George Skakel hadn't done any of those things, and he didn't have anything in common with the people who had done those things. How would they know? Had they ever bothered to get to know him? George Skakel has built an empire out of nothing. And you'd think that those dads, who also all were in business, would have liked to pick his brain. But no, they can't be bothered because he didn't go to Yale, Princeton, or Harvard. Disgusting elitism. Few, if any, of the people of Ethel's friends would ever socialize with Big Ann and George. As the daughter of a longtime Greenwich family observed years later, my parents and Ethel's just wouldn't have been congenial together. Their backgrounds were so different. They just didn't have anything in common. Pan Jacob, looking back to those years, recalled Ethel telling her how much her family loved Larchmont House because it wasn't as rigidly snobbish as Greenwich, and there were more Catholics there. The Skakels were not in the social register, and that was the problem for them. Very sad problem, she observed. I felt the Skakels were sort of pathetic, moving into Greenwich with this incredible powerhouse of people, the WASP culture of the world, and they did it only because of taxes. They were too naive to know what they were really getting into. They were totally ignored, totally shunned. I'd heard remarks about them from my mother or my mother's friends. They viewed the Skakels as very nouveau. Well, of course, their money's new. You can maybe not want to socialize with people because maybe their household was just too wild for you to let your kids go over there. I mean, sometimes you have to make that judgment call as a parent. You can't send your kid to play with every family because sometimes some families, the way that they run the house is just not something you would feel safe with your kid being, or you just don't know them well enough. I mean, there are some real reasons why you might not let your kids go over there, but because their money is new, we can't have that. What is that reason? It was hurtful for the children, too, although Ethel wasn't terribly conscious of any of that. I know she thought about who she was, but her way of dealing with herself was to joke about herself. Rushton Skakel, who finally decided to leave Greenwich in 1993, acknowledged, we weren't accepted for a long time, and maybe never. We hadn't been brought up in a Greenwich type of world. We were brought up in the Chicago way, where you were innocent until proven guilty, but in Greenwich, you were guilty until proven innocent. You could live there for 40 years, and you wouldn't know your neighbor's middle name. In Chicago, everybody was effusive, outgoing, and talkative. There's no braggadocio. In Greenwich, it was, what club do you belong to? Where do you vacation? Let me tell you something right now. Having just moved to Northern Virginia, where I continually cross paths with just this sort, I have to say to myself, I feel like I might be a Skakel. I feel like I am a Skakel. The number of times my neighbors have come up to me to question me and, what I'm allowing my children to do over at my house is getting real old, real quick. I let my kids climb trees. They're allowed to make a fire in the fire pit by themselves. I completely trust my 11-year-old to do it. And the number of times neighbors have come to me and been like, do you know your son is starting a fire in the fire pit? Did you know I saw him climbing a tree? It's like, yeah, they're kids. They play outside. You got a problem with that? You have had a chance to raise your own kids, okay? So why don't you just back up? Anyway, maybe that's why I feel so about this chapter, because I feel like how the Skakels must have felt. Anyway, worse still, the same intense prejudice towards Catholics that George Skakel's parents had nurtured on the barren plains of South Dakota in the late 1800s now affected his own family. In the mid-1930s, in the drawing rooms, private clubs, and salons of that WASP enclave, a strong anti-Catholicism, not to mention racism and anti-Semitism, flourished. The wealthy department store family, Isaac and Bernard Gimbel, had managed to move into Greenwich in the early 30s, but Bernard's wife, Alva, couldn't join the hunt because she was a Jewess. Really? Wow. That is, and then, all these like high-minded ideals during World War II. Can you believe that in Germany they don't like Jews? Can you believe it? It's like, well, why don't you guys examine your own souls? Why don't you elitists examine your own souls and see how you feel about Jews? And then get back to me. Pan Jacob, who came from a highly educated family and was herself a precocious bookworm, was brought up believing that Catholics were inferior and different. Though she never said anything to Ethel, Pan would have sworn as a child that Catholics could be identified by an odor that Episcopalians didn't have. Other than Ethel, I didn't know any Catholics except our maids, and they smelled different, Jacob acknowledged later. I guess it was the incense they burned in their rooms, I don't know, but that's how I identified a Catholic, by their smell. Pan Jacob. It didn't take a lot of perception on George's part to see that the family was being snubbed. The fact that all the Skakels were perceived as Catholics, even though George himself wasn't, added to their difficulty, so he decided to take steps that he hoped would ease the family's path into Greenwich's social mainstream. His first move was to make certain that the other residents recognized the fact that he himself wasn't Catholic. In a Greenwich directory that gave biographical data on the town's most prominent residents, George listed his church as Episcopalian, even though he'd never attended a day in his adult life. He fancifully listed the Kent Preparatory School as one of the places where he was educated. His next step was to convince Big Ann to allow the Skakel girls to go to a non-denominational school to assimilate. He felt that their Catholic education was far too insular, Martin McNally acknowledged later. Remember, you'll recall that Martin McNally is sort of the boys' tutor and sort of, factotum. I don't exactly know what his role was in the family. Kind of a clingers-on, if you ask me, but it was the first time in the early 2 decades of marriage that he interjected himself in Big Ann's role as the family's Catholic leader. Not surprisingly, his request resulted in one of the few marital battles. But in the end, Big Ann conceded with a proviso that later she be allowed to send Ethel and her sisters to Catholic boarding schools and colleges. George, having won what he felt was a major victory, readily agreed. At that point, Big Ann was willing to try anything, so unhappy was she about the family's reception in Greenwich. Once, when Pan Jacob's mother stopped to pick up her daughter, the usually ebullient Big Ann let down her hair for a rare moment. Despite the trappings of wealth, she admitted, "I'm miserable here. I'd be willing to crawl the length of Michigan Avenue on my hands and knees if only Mr. Skakel would take me back to Chicago." Poor thing. Poor Big Ann. I hate it for her. This really isn't the place for her. Okay, now this next chapter is called A Wasp School, and you guys, hold on to your hair, because I have to say, there's a section in here that I was absolutely slammed to the floor by. I could not even believe what I was reading. All right, Big Ann took the girls, Ethel and Pat, who were the only ones in grammar school at the time, out of Sister Rose Alma's Dominican day school and enrolled them in Greenwich Academy, where Ethel quickly assimilated, rising above her family's problems. Ethel had the best of it because she was younger. She could make contacts and grow up within the community of Greenwich Academy and have friends, Pan Jacob observed later. Ethel was so open and so honest that everybody adored her. She was successful because she was so natural about herself. Located in a red brick building on Maple Street, Greenwich Academy was founded as a co-ed institution in 1827 by Dr. Darius Mead, a Greenwich native and minister of the Second Congregational Church. At one point in the mid-1800s, the school's property was controlled by New York political power William Marcy Boss Tweed, and one of his sons, Charlie, had been a Greenwich Academy student. By the time Big Ann enrolled Ethel, Greenwich Academy was considered one of the leading day schools for girls in the Northeast, a school that instilled God and country and all the good things, said Peggy Klipstein Larned, a proud graduate. Every morning at assembly, we had to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and sing an Episcopalian hymn. The school was sort of based on the English system. It was strict. Yeah, well, I can't overstate how shocked I'm about to be. Ethel was required to wear a winter uniform that consisted of a green Harris tweed skirt and jacket, a blouse with a tan necktie, lisle stockings, held up by garters, and brown shoes with a big ugly tongue. In spring, the uniform changed to cotton dresses. Even our underpants had to match, said Larned. We were just like cookie-cutter kids. Ethel arrived at Greenwich Academy each day in a chauffeur-driven car, her driver armed with a loaded revolver, standard operating procedure in the wake of the Leopold and Loeb and Lindbergh baby kidnappings. She was one of the skinniest girls in class, but always had a voracious appetite, coming to school each day with the same snack in a brown bag. While the other girls had cookies and milk, Ethel consumed 2 huge sandwiches. white bread covered with peanut butter, jelly, mayonnaise, and lettuce, which turned the stomachs of her classmates. What an unusual combination. I mean, where did she come up with that? It's like two different kinds of sandwiches put together. As part of the sports program, the only area of academia where Ethel ever excelled, the school offered a curious course to improve posture developed by a French woman named Bess Messendiek, who asserted that, quote, our present-day physical education cannot do away with such prevalent defects as stooped shoulders, bowed legs, crooked arms, weak ankles, and sunken arches. Greenwich Academy's impeccably erect headmistress, Ruth West Campbell, was a staunch advocate, and the Messendiek system was eagerly adopted into the curriculum. Now, this is where it gets weird, you guys. As a result, Ethel and the other girls were required to perform their exercises in the nude, in a special studio equipped with full-length mirrors and a camera. Snapshots of the girls were then used to critique their posture. Because we couldn't do that with their clothes on. How could we see if their back was hunched? About 10 of us at a time had to get stark naked in front of those cameras and the mirrors and do the forward bend and the squat. Is that required for your posture? I'm sorry, what? I know that after Ethel married into the Kennedys, said one of her classmates, she joked that one of the pictures of her might turn up in a girly magazine and become a political bombshell. Rumors also persisted for years that the juiciest glossies were smuggled out and secretly circulated at the nearby Brunswick School for Boys. What other use would they have but to secretly be taken and used by some nefarious, disgusting toad? That is disgusting and so unnecessary. And the fact that any of this would go on, and all of the WASP parents, that we're going to continue to use that term, who just feel that they are established individuals in the best parts of society, would let their girls be marched into a room stark naked, a room full of cameras and mirrors, where they're supposed to bend over and squat because we got to make sure you don't have fallen arches. It's unbelievable to me. Who are these people who think they're so much better than the world but would put their daughters in such a precarious situation to only have those pictures leaked to somewhere else? And of course they were. But any photograph of Ethel wouldn't have been very titillating because, according to Pan Jacob, she didn't have any bosom. Puberty didn't seem to happen to her. Skinny and self-conscious, Ethel watched anxiously as the bodies of Pan and her other classmates blossomed while hers remained flat and straight as a board. Anne Morningstar Hubreth, one of Ethel's pals during adolescence, recalled that Ethel didn't reach puberty until the age of 16. It bothered her, and it bothered her mother even more. I went through that period of time with Ethel, and it was worrisome and problematic for her. Then it came along finally. There was a change in her body, but she never had to wear a C-cup, but everything was fine. Is that not wild to you? Am I the only one that's sitting here like, what? That is so wildly inappropriate and so clearly an abuse of power that I am astounded that no parent marched themselves up there and was like, what? I understand that there was a time in history where people just kind of sent their kids to school and pretty hands off, and they're like, I'm sure they're doing everything fine, But maybe it's instances like this that have let people realize that you kind of have to be a little bit more nosy about what's going on in your kid's school, because otherwise you don't know. Maybe they're being told to strip down and bend over and let's take a picture of you because, those fallen arches are a serious thing. Jeez. Okay, this next chapter, which will be our last chapter, is called Bearer of the Cross. And it's really about Big Anne and her crusade to help her neighbors become Catholic. Now, I had somebody mention in the comments they thought this book was very anti-Catholic, and I don't think it's anti-Catholic at all. Because I think the point is that Big Anne wasn't allowed to be herself and to bear her religion in the way that she wanted to without, a lot of people giving each other the side eye and sort of snickering behind their handkerchiefs at Big Anne. I don't think it's anti-Catholic at all, but I do think that they put a strong emphasis on their religion because it was a big part of the Skakel household to be Catholic. And they were persistent in their Catholicism despite the fact that their Protestant neighbors were unwelcoming of that. So anyway, this chapter is called Bearer of the Cross. Ethel's pal Pixie Meek was the daughter of one of Greenwich's most established families. Her father, Samuel Meek, an executive at J. Walter Thompson, was responsible for the growth of advertising in Europe. Pixie's mother, Priscilla, also educated at Miss Porter's with Pan Jacob's mother, Aunt Dorothy Bush, was establishing herself as one of Greenwich's grand dames. When Pixie and Pan and the other young ladies from Greenwich Academy came to visit Ethel, George would nod to Big Anne as if to say, I was right. Look at the caliber of Ethel's circle of friends now that she's out of Catholic school. Big Anne would give big bear hugs to all the girls who visited, and over homemade cookies and cakes, she'd ask probing questions about their backgrounds. "Now, dear, who did you say your father was?" Franny Pryor Hawes' father, Sam Pryor, for one, was aide-de-camp to Pan American Airlines founder Juan Trippe. Pryor was a colorful fellow who had mynah birds and gibbon apes as house pets, boasted that he met a gibbon in Africa who drank martinis and liked to shoot off guns in the middle of the night to scare Ethel and his daughter when they had sleepovers in tents on the Pryor grounds. See, that seems right up the Skakel Avenue. Why in the world is everybody acting like the Skakels are the crazies when they literally have a neighbor over here who keeps mynah birds and gibbon apes and shoots guns in the middle of the night to scare the kids out in the tents? Like, that seems pretty wild, but everyone could point a finger at the Skakels. Franny had the kind of breeding that George sought in his daughter's new friends. But like many of the others, she was an Episcopalian, which didn't sit well with Big Ann, who frequently proselytized when Ethel's pals came to visit. She'd sweep me into her arms and those great big bosoms of hers and tell me about going to Catholic school, Franny said later. She really wanted me to go. Likewise, Ethel often spoke of the virtues of her religion and eagerly took her friends to Sunday Mass at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Greenwich. "I used to have to go to church with her on our way to horse shows," said Hawes, who, along with Ethel, had taken up riding with a passion. "To look more presentable in church, we'd wear those long raincoats that Ethel supplied to cover up our riding clothes. I remember being scared to death because I didn't know how to genuflect. I used to follow Ethel in and just do whatever she did. It was a big mystery." Anne Morningstar Hubreth also was forced to go to church with Ethel when they were on the horse show circuit. But I couldn't swallow the Catholic faith, so she and I just never discussed religion. Like Pan Jacob, Pixie Meek never had a Catholic friend before Ethel. "Everything I know about Catholicism at the time, she taught me," Pixie said later. "I was fascinated. If we missed a day of church, it wasn't a sin, but for Ethel it was, so I was intrigued by that. She was very devotedly religious, extremely so. She used to tell me she'd only marry a Catholic." Naturally, the girls would go home filled with thoughts and questions about what they heard and saw at the Skakels, the crosses on the walls, the priests and nuns who were frequent guests of Big Ann's, the rosary beads that Ethel carried everywhere, the library shelves filled to the ceiling with books on Catholicism, the constant proselytizing. Franny Pryor Hawes said that when her mother heard about Big Ann's Catholic school lobbying, quote, "she was absolutely adamant that I do not listen to that kind of talk. There was a point where I didn't go to the Skakel house on weekends anymore, and probably because of my mother's influence." What is a big deal if they want you to go to Catholic school? I mean, just be like, well, no. I mean, it's not like you have to ban your child from going over there, but maybe she didn't want her daughter to feel like she was less than because she wasn't Catholic, maybe? I mean, I don't know. I just don't really see what the big deal is. It's not like she was like, hey, you know what? What if we went out back and sacrificed some animals to Satan? At that point, you can say, I don't think you're going to go over to the Skakel's house anymore. But so what if the mom's like, Catholic school's great? You know, all you have to say is, thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Skakel. I mean, it's not like a thing you have to be offended about. Relatives, particularly from the Skakel side, were also put off. One summer, George Skakel's sister-in-law and young son came to visit. It was quite an eye-opener for 8-year-old Bob Skakel and his mom, who at the time were living in virtual poverty in a 3-room house on the Texas-Mexican border, where James Curtis Skakel Jr. worked as a U.S. Border Patrolman. The swimming pool, the 30 rooms. I must say I was a little green-eyed, recalled Bob Skakel years later. My father was nothing like Uncle George. Dad couldn't sell a dollar bill for 50 cents if he tried. But by the end of the month-long visit, Bob had lost all feelings of envy. He watched as Ethel's brothers arrived home from their various boarding schools, only to be shipped out again a few days later to go to summer camp. Upstairs on the 3rd floor, completely ignored by the brothers, was a room filled with electric trains that made Bob's mouth water because he had only a cheap wind-up set. He watched as Ethel sat at an elegant grand piano in the huge library confidently playing Red Sails in the Sunset for a small audience of her mother's matronly friends, who applauded the child's efforts politely. But there was something missing in this opulent lifestyle. What I saw, observed Bob Skakel later, was too much money, too much everything, and no closeness. I felt sorry for the boys having to go away to camp when they'd just come home from school. I felt I wouldn't trade places with them for anything in the world. I felt the same way as an adult. Now, this next story is really interesting to me because through just one strange episode after another, I have found myself in many circles of people who have had money, and probably because I've taught at private schools where the attendees had money. So I have never been a person of any sort of breeding or monetary status. And yet I found myself a lot of times with people who have been. This next story really highlights some of the entitlement that I've seen, particularly when people just have so much money that they've forgotten the fact that they got here through hard work. And so it's like, they strove there, but they somehow don't want their children to have to strive the way they strove. And so the children are just really, really heaped on with this sense of entitlement. I mean, even in the sense that she would sit down and play some song on the piano, not very well, sort of sloppily, and everyone's clapping like it was the best thing they ever heard. And it's like, but it really wasn't. Why are you rewarding this child? And I'm not saying that you have to like go up to her and be like, that was terrible. But to constantly insert in this child's mind that, you did a fantastic job, that nobody could do it better than you, and it was really half-assed and a job not well done. That was something I saw a lot in teaching in schools, where people would consistently come to me and say, can't you just give her the A? You gave my child a B- on this project. Why did you decide to hurt him like that? Well, it was B- work. He was trying, though. Well, he told me he started this project last night at midnight. I feel I was pretty generous with a B-. Well, he's just got so many things to do. Can't you imagine that he has so many things to do? He's in so many club sports. And so it's like this constant, do you want your child to succeed? If you want your child to succeed, you've got to let them struggle. Okay. And you cannot continually come on the back end to me and be like, okay, I know he didn't if you want to be nitpicky about it, you can say it was a B-, but think about how many other things he has to do and then come up with a grade for him. Like that kind of behavior. What are you talking about? Right. And that's what we're about to see illustrated in this next story. One afternoon, Big Ann took her nephew to see Ethel compete in a swimming meet at a country club in New Rochelle. Bob was shocked to see Ethel win a bronze medal by blatantly cheating. The pool was perhaps 100 feet long, and the lanes were divided with a rope, supported by buoys every 10 feet, he remembered clearly. There were only 3 girls competing. While the other 2 girls swam, Ethel pulled herself along on the rope. Naturally, she won. I just thought that was pretty damn unfair, and I was a little ticked off at her. Everyone there, like Big Ann, was all quite well-to-do, and they thought, how cute! Ethel acted as if she actually deserved winning, and so did Big Ann. But the greatest impact on the boy and his mother came from the religious atmosphere in the Skakel house. Because his father was still spewing the anti-Catholic vitriol he'd heard from his parents, young Bob was more than a little surprised to visit relatives whose home resembled a cathedral. On Sunday after Mass, the sisters and priests came for cocktails and conversation, he recalled. It was a Sunday afternoon ritual. I'd never seen anything like it. Aunt Anne always held forth. Ethel's religious fervor also surfaced. A small, thin, bashful boy, Bob spent afternoons playing with Ethel and her sister Pat in Ethel's second-floor room, which paid homage to her 2 consuming passions, horses and Catholicism. Over her bed hung a large cross and rosary beads. Books on Catholicism were stacked on the night table. One day, out of the blue, Ethel's impish face took on a serious expression. You're not going to heaven when you die, Bob Skakel, Ethel said with conviction. Do you know that? Stunned, the boy stuttered. What? Why not? In a more mocking and teasing sing-song tone, Ethel continued, Yeah, Bob Skakel, you're not Catholic, so you're not going to heaven. You're going to hell. His face burned with embarrassment, near tears. Bob ran from Ethel's room, the sound of her laughter ringing in his ears, and into the arms of his mother, who'd been resting in the guest room. Mom, he blurted out, his voice quivering, I'm not going to heaven. Doris Skakel smiled gently. Why not? She asked. Because I'm not Catholic. That's what Ethel said. Ethel said I'm not going to heaven because I'm not Catholic. After a few moments, Doris Skakel managed to reassure her son that he'd go to heaven whether he was Catholic or not. Don't worry, she said, patting his head. Your cousin Ethel was just kidding. But Doris wasn't surprised by Ethel's taunts. One afternoon, the sisters-in-law were chatting in the kitchen, when Big Ann brought up her favorite subject in a manner that left Doris nonplussed. Doris, if you and Kurt would become Catholic, there's nothing I wouldn't do for you, Big Ann said suddenly. Keenly aware that her sister-in-law very much wanted all the family to be Catholic, Doris attempted to change the subject, but to no avail. Big Ann said, It'd be very beneficial. Things could be much better. We could do a lot for you and Kurt. Years later, Doris Skakel said, I viewed what she said to me as a bribe. I didn't like what she said, but I didn't answer her back, and I never told Kurt because it would have made him angry. Well, yeah, because Catholicism isn't a club. It's not a club in which you give those within the club a hand up because they see it the way you do. I mean, I don't think that's exactly what God's talking about when he talks about Christian charity. On the other occasion during the visit, Doris accompanied Big Ann and the children to Sunday Mass. Afterward, a group of friends returned to Lake Avenue for drinks on the sun porch. Doris Skakel was sitting by herself reading the newspaper when she overheard some of the others loudly discussing damned heretics. Their feeling was that if you didn't believe in Catholicism, you were a heretic. And I thought, well, God, that's me. And it hurt and made me feel alienated, she recalled. I thought, my goodness, is that the way they feel if you're not Catholic? One of the men who was involved in the conversation suddenly sat down next to me and said, Hello, aren't you one of the Skakels from out west? I was so angry I said, Yes, I'm one of the goddamn heretics. He looked shocked and embarrassed, and that ended the discussion. Doris Skakel said she never mentioned the incident to Ethel's father because, quote, I knew how upset it would have made him. Of Big Anne's 7 children, Ethel was most like her mother. From the time she was a little child, Ethel helped Big Anne carry the cross, Martin McNally observed. There was only 2 things of real importance in Ethel's life. Jesus Christ was first, and later came Bobby Kennedy. Over the years, because of her incessant proselytizing, Big Anne won more than a few converts, a skill she taught Ethel, who would have her own successes later in life. If you're constantly sharing Catholicism as though it's a big club that you should be a part of, it's no shock that people would want to join in, because it would seem that with the club comes money and some success. You know, some of these East Coast Catholics, and the same thing with the East Coast Protestants. I mean, it's just like 2 big clubs that you can be a part of. It's got really nothing to do with Jesus Christ. You know, he's a really enticing mascot, but it's really more like, I'll give you a hand up, if you give me a hand up, we're all Catholics together. And it's really more club-like, just like with the Protestants, like with this WASP community. It's not about the religion. Those are rites and rituals that you participate as part of the club. And I'm not saying that there aren't people within both of these enclaves who take their religiosity very seriously. But when you are framing becoming a Catholic as in becoming part of a club, it's not surprising that there would be some successes in your proselytizing, because who doesn't want to be part of a club? From the time the Skakels moved to Lake Avenue, Big Anne had begun filling the shelves of her immense library with books on Catholicism, some of them rare and priceless manuscripts in first editions. Through her friendship with Daniel C. Walsh, a professor who would teach philosophy to Ethel at college, Big Anne became the first secretary to Thomas Merton, a Roman Catholic Trappist monk. Merton's best-selling autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, had been published to great critical acclaim while he was living at Our Lady of Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky. The Skakels were our earliest and best benefactors, said Brother Patrick Hart of Our Lady of Gethsemane Abbey, who followed Big Anne as Merton's secretary. By financing the monastery, the Skakels were allowing a monk to sit at a typewriter and write. Big Anne's friends always worried that her devotion and generosity made her a sitting duck for charlatan clerics. But in the case of Merton, it appeared as if the innocent monastic monk was being taken for a ride by Big Anne herself. As Merton's secretary, she was able to keep his increasingly valuable original drafts. She had at least 5 of them. Sign of Jonas, Ascent to Truth, No Man is an Island, Last of the Fathers, and Silence of Heaven, and a number of his first editions that he signed for her. Anne was interested in authors and wanted to get their manuscripts, explained Brother Patrick. She was a great saver, a great collector. Originally, I thought Merton was the only one, but Anne said that she got manuscripts from other writers whom she didn't identify. She'd tell them, I'd love to do your secretarial work. She'd get the manuscripts that were annotated by the author, and she would have the secretaries type clean copies, whatever number the author wanted. But Anne kept the original, which had all the author's markings. As a result, she built a superb collection. She was shrewd enough to know that these would be very valuable. She'd have them bound elegantly in leather, just gorgeously, the best binding you could imagine. She realized the value in Merton, that he had a powerful voice, and that people would have to reckon with him in years to come. It's my feeling that Mrs. Skakel obviously thought that she could cash in on those manuscripts someday. That's so shady. Why would you keep something that clearly belongs to the author? An annotated version of a manuscript is the author's property. It's not for you, Big Anne. Big Anne never lifted a finger to type the manuscripts. She hired several women to do that, along with opening and answering Merton's fan mail. But because of her efforts, Dom M. James Fox, the 6th abbot of Gethsemane, a frequent guest at Lake Avenue, christened the Skakel house Regina Laudis in praise of the Virgin. Big Anne proudly used the Latin name on her personal stationery. Years later, a chapel was dedicated in honor of the Skakels at Our Lady of Gethsemane Abbey. For a time in the mid-40s, Big Anne Skakel became part owner of the Guild Bookshop, which specialized in religious books, at 117 East 57th Street in New York City. Her partners included Hilda Shriver, mother of Sergeant Shriver, and Mrs. Maisie Ward Sheed, author of a popular new book at the time, The Splendor of the Rosary. The shop specialized in religious tracts and books aimed at lay people considering conversion. At first, Anne Skakel spent several days at the shop, checking incoming stock for first editions that she added gratis to her library. She also went to the shop to socialize with many of the other Catholic matrons who stopped in to browse. The shop lasted only a few years, lost money, and was sold. One day, Big Ann walked past the shop with a friend and turned red with anger and embarrassment. She'd been describing the store's virtuous and pious past when she suddenly saw the book being featured in the window. It was Polly Adler's A House is Not a Home, a best-selling story about a madam and her prostitutes. George Skakel distanced himself from his wife's religious interests and warned friends and colleagues to do the same. When Great Lakes geologist J. Mayhew was about to make his first visit to Lake Avenue, George warned him about his wife's library. He told May, "Don't you dare go into that room. You don't want to see it." It was obvious, I concluded, that he didn't agree with her Catholicism, recalled Mayhew, a Quaker. George said he just didn't like the library. He surprised me because he never indicated in any other way, at any other time, that there was some point of disagreement between him and his wife. One afternoon, waiting until her husband was out of the house, Big Ann dragged the reluctant Mayhew into the library. She just said, "Come on, I'm taking you to see it." Who was I to say no to her? She was the boss's wife. The room looked like the Mormon tabernacle, only on a smaller scale. There were religious statues and busts and figures with wings like angels and floor-to-ceiling books. By the time Bob Skakel and his mother had come east, there was a well-defined schism between Big Ann and the Skakel family over the issue of her Catholicism. There was not a lot of closeness with Grandmother Grace Skakel and Big Ann at that point in time, acknowledged Bob Skakel. The division between her Catholicism and the Skakels' Protestantism was very strong. Their differences were so great, in fact, that George's mother never visited her son's family. In hopes of making peace, George once took his wife Ethel and Jim to California, the first and last time that Ethel met her paternal grandmother. George really liked those family get-togethers, Doris Skakel, his sister-in-law, recalled. But the bad blood and hostility that existed between his wife and mother, two strong-willed, sharp-tongued, opinionated women, was so overt that George finally dropped any hope he held for a rapprochement. During that visit, Doris Skakel said, Big Ann grabbed Gracie, a tiny and frail-looking woman, as she walked out of the kitchen. Ann plunked Gracie on her knee and proceeded to bounce her up and down like a child, while Gracie tried desperately to squirm free, helpless in Big Ann's grasp. Ann laughed uproariously. You could hear her a block away. And Gracie was horribly, horribly embarrassed. I was really shocked. If George had been there, he'd been very upset. That is a very strange thing for a daughter-in-law to do to her mother. I mean, the mother seems like she was kind of a nut too, though. Like, why in the world would you not become close to your son and his kids and wife just because, they practice their belief in Jesus Christ differently than you practice your belief in Jesus Christ? That just seems insane to me. In the end, George used the excuse of business trips to the West Coast to visit his mother, leaving Big Ann behind. He also became his mother's main source of financial support. On one visit, he asked his sister Margaret for the keys to the car, returning to the house an hour later with a gift, a new model Ford. On January 4th, 1936, Grace Skakel died of a heart attack at the age of 78. George flew out and made her funeral arrangements, but no one in the family could remember Big Ann or any of her brood being present at the service, which was held in a small Episcopalian church. About religion, George tried to be open-minded. He once fired a Great Lakes Coal and Coke personal manager when the man, knowing George wasn't Catholic, boasted to him that he didn't hire Catholics at his plant. According to his son Rushton, George Skakel harbored no prejudices. Every man was equal in his eyes. Associates of his father supported the son's contention. Rushton asserted that his father, quote, got the first Jew in, as a member of the exclusive Greenwich Country Club in the 1940s. Eager to underscore his father's liberalism even more, Skakel said he himself was permitted to learn to swim at a Jewish community center when the family still lived in Chicago. The Jews, he noted, were the only ones who could afford a pool. While his father wasn't a Catholic, Rushton maintained he was godly good. To stress that fact, he said, during my whole life, my father told me only one joke that was not nice. He said, I know a lady who sleeps with cats, and sometimes Mr. Nussbaum, too. Cats being spelled capital K-A-T-Z. Okay, so that's where we're going to end our reading today, but I don't know about you. I just find this whole world fascinating. Just so fascinating. What in the world? Tell me what you thought was the most interesting part of today's episode in the comments, and I can't wait to keep reading this with you later this week. Thanks so much for stopping by. See you soon.